In the shadowed heart of Chicago, where sirens sing lullabies and concrete keeps secrets, one act of arrogance set a storm in motion. It wasn't the slap that changed everything. It was who got slapped. A racist cop, the wrong judge, and within 4 minutes, a system that had thrived in silence began to choke on its own noise. Officer Brent Mallory had long stopped seeing people. He saw patterns. He saw risk, resistance, profiles. The uniform was his shield, his license, his identity. Every day, he rolled through the city like a storm cloud in motion, sunglasses low, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near his holster. 17 years on the force had corroded whatever flicker of compassion he once carried. He walked like a man immune to consequence, eyes always calculating who could be pressed, who would stay silent. In his mind, he was untouchable. He had friends in high places, favors stacked in cold folders, and a department that circled the wagons without question. That night, the city was wet with rain, puddles reflecting distorted flashes of neon. Brent had parked beneath a flickering streetlight, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. When he saw the Navy sedan glide past, no erratic movement, no infraction, just the wrong neighborhood, the wrong hour, and a woman driving alone. He pulled out without a second thought, the sirens screaming against the night's silence. He didn't care who she was. He cared only that she looked like every other story he thought he knew before it began. The badge on his chest didn't beat like a heart. It pulsed with arrogance. He wasn't hunting crime. He was feeding control. The sedan stopped at the corner of Halsted and Jackson. Officer Mallory approached like a man expecting submission. She rolled down the window, calm, poised. "Is there a reason you've stopped me?" she asked, her voice cool but firm. Mallory's hand twitched. He didn't answer. Instead, he yanked open the door. She held out her ID, quietly, steadily. His eyes didn't even lower to read it. "Step out, now." She resisted, only slightly, only with words. Words that rang with dignity. "I haven't broken any law." That was when it happened. A flash. His hand met her face, the crack of palm to cheek, ringing out louder than the siren ever had. Her head turned, but she didn't break. Her eyes stayed on him, glassy but unyielding. Not rage, not fear. Silence. Not the silence of submission, but the silence that comes before a storm. Unaware of the gravity of his mistake, Officer Mallory returned to his cruiser with a sharp exhale, satisfied, as though slapping a woman had somehow realigned the city with his will. Rain tapped the windshield in soft pulses, and the lights from the street lamps danced across the hood of the patrol car like indifferent spirits, bearing silent witness. He didn't notice the teenager across the street, slouched beneath the half-broken bus stop shelter, hoodie soaked, phone aimed directly at him. He didn't think about the street camera looming just 20 feet above. And, in a final act of his own undoing, he didn't remember that his own body cam had never been turned off. It caught everything. The moment her door was yanked open, her calm, level voice offering her ID, and the quick, brutal crack of his hand across her face. The footage was sterile, clinical in its documentation. But what it failed to mute was the violence. Not just in action, but in intention. The kind of violence built over years of unchecked authority. The kind that didn't need to be loud to be devastating. The slap echoed only once in real time. But on video, it replayed endlessly. 1,000 times in 1,000 hands. The teenager at the bus stop uploaded the clip to a live stream within minutes, adding no words, just the caption. "This is Chicago." His audience was modest, fewer than 100 followers, mostly local, mostly quiet. But one follower shared it, then another, and another. By the time Mallory had made it back to the station, muttering a false report about uncooperative behavior, the clip had crossed 100,000 views. A traffic camera feed, once archived and ignored, was quietly accessed by a city transportation worker who had seen the viral post and wanted confirmation. What he found chilled him. A second angle, clearer, from above, showing the aggression, the woman's composure, and the officer's face without shadow. In another part of the city, in a cramped dorm room at Northwestern, a journalism student saw the video and began comparing it against the city's judge directory. The ID Judge Ruiz had held out, unread, had caught the light for just a frame, and in that frozen moment, her name could be seen. The student recognized her. Ruiz had been a guest lecturer just a month prior. Calm, brilliant, powerful, in a quiet way that stayed with you. He tweeted her name alongside the video. Judge Alana Ruiz. CPD just slapped a sitting judge across the face. By dawn, it had over 2 million views. The image of her face, turned in pain, her hand still outstretched holding her credentials, had become an unshakable symbol. Her silence in the video, gripping. Not a scream, not a fight, just the silence of someone who had fought 1,000 battles already and knew this one was different. But while the city shook with the first tremors of realization, Judge Ruiz herself sat at her kitchen table in darkness, hands resting on a folded linen napkin, a single teacup untouched before her. She had not spoken to the press. She had not posted anything. Her phone buzzed every 30 seconds. Attorneys, friends, media outlets, government officials. But she let it ring. The world was waking up to what had happened, but Ruiz was already 10 steps ahead, not because she was vengeful, but because she was prepared. She had been watching the rot grow in the walls of the justice system for years, slow, silent, shielded by process and protocol. What happened last night hadn't broken her. It had activated something she'd been waiting to unleash. At 9:12 a.m., she arrived at her chambers. The staff stood when she entered, unsure whether to speak or remain still. Her cheek was faintly swollen, and a trace of bruising had begun to bloom along her jaw, but she wore it like a crown, an unspoken accusation and an undeniable truth. She looked directly at her clerk and said, "We begin today." She met first with her legal team, not to file charges, not yet. She wanted a list of every pending civil complaint against Mallory and any officer tied to his precinct. She demanded sealed reports, IA reviews buried beneath red tape, prior excessive force allegations dismissed due to lack of evidence. With each document retrieved, a pattern emerged. Mallory wasn't just one bad actor. He was a hinge in a larger machine. Dozens of complaints, few consequences, promotions instead of penalties. By 11:00 AM, Ruiz had initiated a motion of judicial inquiry under a rarely used clause of the Illinois Judicial Code. By invoking her authority not as a victim, but as a judge and officer of the court, she turned the narrative. She didn't just want justice, she wanted transparency. The motion called for the immediate release of officer conduct records under public interest clauses, bypassing union protections. Every word of her filing was deliberate. She used no adjectives, she gave no rhetoric, just facts. Cold, exact, irrefutable. But between the lines, there was fire. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, anticipating a statement. She gave none. The silence drew louder. And then, something else began to unfold. quietly at first, anonymous emails, encrypted messages from other officers, from clerks, from people she didn't know, but who had been waiting for someone, anyone, to step forward first. One message read, "What he did to you, he's done to others, but none of us were judges." Another came with attachments, audio files, dispatch logs, body cam footage from prior incidents, mysteriously lost during internal reviews. Ruiz had cracked something open, not just in the system, but in the hearts of those long buried by fear. Across town, Mallory was beginning to sweat, not because he feared punishment, he had never known it, but because something was different this time. The silence was not in his favor. His union rep had gone quiet. His captain avoided his calls, and when he walked into the precinct that afternoon, he noticed the looks, not of solidarity, but of calculation. Cow workers, whispering, eyes down, as if watching someone fall from a great height. In an empty break room, he pulled out his phone, watched the video for the first time and again. He watched her not flinch, not scream, just stare at him with a knowing glint that pierced through the screen. He saw the teenager in the background, the body cam indicator flashing red. He realized then that he had not just slapped a woman, he had slapped the wrong one. Back in her chambers, Ruiz continued assembling her case. Not against a man, but against a system. She issued subpoenas with surgical précis. She cross-referenced internal memos with public statements. She traced patterns of suppression, cover-ups, and quietly settled lawsuits. Her team said little, working in hushed coordination. Some were angry, others wept quietly behind closed doors, because they knew what she was doing had never been done at this scale, at this speed. The building was humming, not with gossip, but with revolution. What Ruiz had uncovered was not just a cop with a temper, or even a precinct with a pattern. It was an organism, a system built on habits of silence, laced together by paperwork, mutual self-interest, and a fear so normalized that even those within it had stopped noticing its shape. Brent Mallory wasn't the disease. He was just the symptom that finally ruptured the skin. The first layer of that rot emerged within hours of her, Emma's first comprehensive dig. Ruiz sat in the war room. What had once been a quiet filing chamber, now stacked with color-coded folders and whiteboards, mapping out names, dates, cases, outcomes. An intern, barely out of law school, trembled as she laid down 2 civil complaints from 2019. One involved a paraplegic man thrown from his wheelchair during a compliance check. Another told of a young black woman threatened with planted drugs unless she handed over her phone. Both had been quietly dismissed in pre-trial hearings. Both involved Officer Brent Mallory. Ruiz didn't speak. She read, slowly, deliberately. And then she asked the clerk to begin assembling a comparative spreadsheet of civil rights complaints from every officer in Mallory's unit over the past 5 years. What appeared on that screen, row by row, revealed not coincidence, not anomaly, but orchestration. 17 officers, 62 complaints, 34 settlements. Not a single recorded disciplinary action. The settlements were listed under administrative review, often paid from municipal risk pools with non-disclosure clauses so tight even whispers felt dangerous. And over each of those names, Mallory, Draper, Nguyen, Barrios, hung the same approving initials. Captain Leonis Hammond. Captain Hammond had once been hailed as a reformer. He appeared in local news segments, posing beside youth outreach programs, smiling wide, speaking of community trust while shaking hands with pastors and aldermen. But Hammond also controlled assignments, dictated who got what shift, and managed the pipeline of probationary officers who were quickly conditioned to conform or disappear. Ruiz recognized the name. She'd seen it on personnel forms. He was the one who had signed off on Mallory's commendation in 2020 for quick response in hostile environments. A commendation tied to a night where 3 complaints had also been filed for excessive force. Ruiz leaned back in her chair. The building had no visible cracks, but now the foundation felt hollow. This was no longer just about accountability. It was about unmasking the architecture of protection, a scaffolding built on paper, intimidation, and generational mistrust. Meanwhile, Mallory was unraveling. He had spent the last 12 hours making phone calls, trying to reach Hammond, trying to get ahead of whatever overreaction was surely brewing. But doors were closing. His voicemail was full. The union had issued a brief public statement defending the valor and record of Officer Mallory while quietly initiating a private review panel, an early sign that they weren't going to shield him indefinitely. At a bar near Midway, 2 officers sat watching the latest update play out on a muted screen. Mallory's face was now the thumbnail on nearly every major network. The chyron beneath it read, Judge Alana Ruiz files historic inquiry into CPD conduct records. One of them, a younger officer with tired eyes, turned to his partner and said, "We really thought she was just another one." But Ruiz hadn't said a word to the press. Not one interview, not one comment. Her silence now had weight. It forced the world to fill in the blanks. And in that vacuum, the facts spoke louder. Every legal step she took had been documented, authenticated, and filed publicly. Her intent was unmistakable. Transparency without spectacle. She wasn't building a narrative, she was building a case. By the next day, Internal Affairs found itself crushed beneath an avalanche of documents, calls, and requests. Usually an office that moved at a glacial pace, IA was now flooded. Tip lines surged. Reports previously ignored were being reopened. 2 whistleblower letters arrived on the same afternoon, both unsigned, both confirming what Ruiz had already suspected. Hammond was at the center, not directly violent perhaps, but the architect. He approved transfers that punished dissenters. He marked evaluations to favor loyalists. He buried misconduct in euphemism. Miscommunication, escalated tensions, tactical necessity. A week after the slap, the dam began to break. Officer Denise Morales, who had once worked under Mallory before, transferring out of fear, came forward. She didn't go to the media. She walked into Ruiz's chambers, sat down, and opened a folder she'd kept hidden in a shoebox beneath her bed for 3 years. It held photos, emails, copies of reports with redacted sections she had quietly saved before they disappeared from her precinct's files. She laid them out in rows, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "Al, they told me not to ask questions," she said, "so I stopped. Until now." Among her documents was a report from a 2018 raid that had gone bad. A teenager had been hospitalized, his jaw broken, ribs fractured. The official report stated he had fallen downstairs while fleeing. But Morales had seen Mallory punch him while the boy was already cuffed. When she tried to file an amended report, Hammond pulled her aside. "Don't let your career bleed out over someone who doesn't matter," he'd said. She transferred to desk duty 2 weeks later. With Morales' documents, Ruiz had leverage. She filed an emergency motion to unseal archived IA files, citing imminent public interest and potential ongoing endangerment. It passed. The floodgates opened. 3 officers were placed on immediate suspension pending review. 2 more were reassigned. Within 72 hours, 10 names were now under active investigation. Mallory had gone from silent defender to radioactive liability. But something deeper had begun. A shift, slow and fragile in the very culture that had sustained him. Inside CPD headquarters, murmurs grew louder. Junior officers talked in parking lots, in stairwells, wondering who else had things to hide. Retired officers began contacting civil rights attorneys, offering information in exchange for protection. One brought forward a flash drive left behind by a former precinct lieutenant. It held scans of 24 internal reports, never filed in central records, including one referencing an incident in 2015, where a known informant was accidentally killed during a sting operation. Mallory's name was on that report too. Ruiz watched it all unfold, not from a stage, but from within walls of paper, data, and strategy. Her team expanded. Volunteers arrived. Law clerks, graduate students, even former prosecutors who had long since left public life, but felt something stirring they thought long dead. Her war room evolved into a command center. Timelines were mapped, connections drawn, with red thread from officer to captain, from precinct to city office. Each complaint became a story. Each story became a dot on the web. Patterns emerged, certain neighborhoods targeted more frequently, complaints spiking during specific shifts, a ghost trail of misconduct thinly veiled as protocol. At one point, Ruiz stepped away from the charts and stood by the window, watching the late afternoon sun stretch across the pavement outside. A child walked past, holding her mother's hand. The mother paused, glanced toward the courthouse, then looked away quickly, pulling her daughter along. Ruiz watched them go, a deep weight pressing behind her ribs. For years, that mother had likely taught her child how to survive, not how to dream, not how to thrive, but how to survive an encounter. That was the legacy Ruiz was confronting, not just injustice, but the normalization of fear. And still, she hadn't spoken to the media. But others were beginning to speak. The families of past victims, emboldened by the judge's refusal to fade quietly, began organizing. Press conferences emerged. A mother whose son had been beaten into a coma in 2017 finally told her story on record. A pastor from Auburn Gresham revealed decades of complaints filed by his congregation, ignored and forgotten. The city was no longer just watching, it was remembering. Mallory, now under house suspension, watched all this unfold with increasing dread. The department that once shielded him was now cutting ties. His union attorney recommended silence. His family stopped visiting. His name had become currency. Every time someone spoke it, it was followed by a question, a gasp, or an indictment. Captain Hammond, meanwhile, stayed outwardly calm, but even he couldn't avoid the changing tides. An anonymous source from the mayor's office leaked that a sealed indictment request had been drafted in the state attorney's office. If it passed, Hammond could be facing obstruction charges, possibly worse. And yet, Ruiz knew the hardest part was still ahead. Exposure was not the same as justice. What they had found so far was only the opening chapters. The real fight, the reform, the rebuilding, the rehumanizing would take years. But what made this moment different, what gave it the strange electricity of something real, was that for the first time in decades, the machine had stalled. The gears had locked. The engine of indifference had been forced to halt. Because someone hadn't just survived the slap, she had refused to be silenced by it. Captain Hammond's fall came not with sirens or spectacle, but with a silent summons delivered by a federal marshal just after sunrise. He was led from his home in handcuffs, his wife watching from the porch in disbelief. The neighborhood hushed in a strange reverence. The charges were sweeping: obstruction of justice, conspiracy, destruction of public records. But what broke him wasn't the arrest. It was the knowledge that officers he once groomed, once silenced, were now testifying freely, their sealed stories finally breathing daylight. As cameras captured his departure, the image went viral within minutes. Not because he was a captain, but because he had come to symbolize the system's arrogance. At precincts across the city, officers stared at the screen. The hush in the room no longer fear, but something closer to reckoning. Inside Ruiz's chambers, the mood was hushed, heavier. The weight of everything, every voice, every document, every uncovered name pressed against the walls. She had become something more than a judge. Her face, once bruised, now appeared on murals, wheat pasted on alley walls and courthouse steps. Not smiling, not angry, just present. A symbol of what couldn't be ignored anymore. She never asked for it. She only asked that the truth remain louder than the noise. And now the noise was thunderous. The city didn't erupt, it exhaled. Protests became vigils. Marches became meetings. Neighborhoods once forgotten began organizing with new clarity. No longer begging for justice, but demanding structure. Ruiz watched from a distance as reform bills were drafted, as oversight committees finally received funding, as former victims stood before microphones with names that could no longer be erased. The judge never claimed credit. She returned to the bench quietly, each case she presided over now carrying the unspoken weight of what had passed. The gavel, once routine, had become sacred. And still beneath it all, a city remembered. Not just the slap, not just the fall, but the power of silence met with action. Ruiz's war room was dismantled, but the movement had not ended. It had only grown. From corners of Chicago where light had rarely touched came voices rising, resilient, relentless, rooted, not in vengeance but in memory. And in the long shadow cast by one brutal moment, justice finally began to feel possible. If this story stirred your soul, if it made your heart pound, your breath catch, or your eyes well with tears, then you've just witnessed the power of truth through the lens of one storyteller. Here, we don't just tell stories, we resurrect voices, we breathe life into silence. We shine a light where others dim it, and we turn whispers of justice into roars that cannot be ignored. This tale wasn't just about a slap or a fall from power. It was about the rise of a truth too heavy to bury. And if that moved you, if it made you believe in the fire of resilience, in the quiet strength of those who refuse to stay silent, then let this not be where our journey ends. Like this video to honor the voices that finally broke through. Share it with someone who still believes change is possible. And subscribe to A1 Storyteller, where every story dares to speak what others won't. One click, and you're not just joining a channel, you're joining a movement. We're not done, we're just getting started.